In this particular lecture 12, I will be discussing about the types of training, because the training designs I have discussed in the module 9, 10 and 11. Now, here we will talk about, that is what type of the training programs that should be preferred and how they are to be executed. Training is generally offered in the following areas, in knowledge areas. In knowledge areas, you will find that whenever we talk about these particular training programs, these training programs in the knowledge, that is basically we talk about the 7 factors here, that is what is, how do you get that particular knowledge, the source of knowledge that is to be trained. I will like to give our academic example first, and that is about the PhD scholars. Now, the PhD scholars, they have been asked, that is the what journals they are supposed to refer. So, with the period of time, with the Emerald and EBSCOs, and now we are talking about the ABDC listed journals and the journals which are SSCI listed journals are there, Scopus listed journals are there. So, these are the certain databases, some of the databases which are very much recognized, and we ask them, that is whenever you are going for the literature review, you should go through these type of the databases for this right. Similarly, when we will talk about the industry knowledge, in the industry knowledge, we are going through, the main focus is on the case studies. That is the what type of the case studies you are supposed to refer, which books you are supposed to refer, which magazines you are supposed to refer, and therefore you will get the idea. And the basic idea is that it should be industry specific. If you are able to get that industry specific knowledge, then in that case definitely you will be getting the higher level of the your knowledge, and in that so one should know, right, that is the in the training in case of the knowledge, that what is the source is there. But in knowledge management, it is not only the get, but it is the use of the knowledge. How do you use that particular knowledge, that is also, because it should be practical, it should be applicable in the field. If any theoretical knowledge is there, classroom knowledge, if it is not practical or it cannot be implemented, then it will be very difficult. For example, the knowledge about the conflict management. In conflict management, there are the 5 strategies, that is avoiding, accommodating, competing, collaborating and compromising. Now, this is a theoretical knowledge, that these are the 5 strategies are there, with the concern of the person with the low and high, and concern of the other person with the low and high, and then, but what is the use? The use of this knowledge is that one should be able to execute the proper conflict management strategy, where the avoidance is required. Then in that case the competitive will not work, but that can be the mistake. That is that there are certain issues in a given situation that one should go for the avoidance, the conflict, but he may enter into a competitive. Sometimes the accommodating is required, not avoiding, accommodating is required, and the person may go into the compromising. So, therefore, what is the difference between the accommodating and compromising? Accommodating is one sided, compromising is both sided. Therefore, that the strategy, conflict management strategy, that will be applicable only in the case of when the appropriate situation has been understood. The person has the knowledge that this is a situation and I have to go either through the avoiding or accommodating or competitive, or the many times it is the which is suggested in general, that is a collaborative, that is the both the parties their concern is high and therefore both have to go together. But it is not possible, that is this is an ideal situation, and that is why the another strategy, that is a compromising strategy, that has been suggested in conflict management. So, they are compromise, but in collaborative and compromising, the big challenge is, that is the orientation of conflict resolving is to be from the both the parties. This cannot be only from the one sided. So, avoidance is from the one sided, accommodating is one sided, competing is that can be one sided or both sided, both you decide it is I will be competing, next person may or may not decide, but next person can be also decide. But in collaboration compromise it is compulsory, that is the both the parties they are willing to resolve the conflict, only in that case collaborative and compromise. So, whenever you use the conflict management strategies, sometimes you become successful, sometimes it becomes failure. So, that is the next stage and that is the learning that you learn, that is maybe in a particular industry. In this particular industry a particular style of the conflict management will work. Organization culture, the pulse of the organization, that is the if there is a conflict in this organization, what will be the right strategy. It depends on the work environment, work culture, it depends on people also naturally, but also the work culture and work environment, the organization culture and work environment, that is what type of these strategies. So, you learn there by experiencing there the way you come across, then you will learn that is how it works. On basis of that what you do, you contribute, that is you practice, you say others, that is the okay, this is the way the conflict management works in this particular organization, because you have learned after using that you have learned that is the how to it works. When you are contribute, then you are able to build and sustain. Because you understood that is this type of the conflict management strategy works in this organization, and therefore, if you are flexible and adaptive, then you will adopt that particular style of the conflict resolution, and then it will be the build and sustain will be there. So, you will continue in that organization for a long time, and conflict resolution you will not create a problem for us, and that is a build and sustain on this. But after some time what you do, you start assess that was that right or wrong, and then you find that yes it was right. So, you divest. This is Van der Rohe model basically. Van der Rohe has given this knowledge management model, that is the person who is going to get these particular knowledge management practices, he should get, use, learn, contribute, build and sustain, assess and divest. So, here you will find that is the way. So, in that case you will find that is this is the way where the person will be able to come out with the right type of the training program. So, he should be given the right type of training programs where he will be able to identify whether he has to go for these two knowledge management to get, use, learn, contribute, build and sustain, and that type of the training programs, right. Conflict management was the one example. If he develops, then he will be able to develop that particular the knowledge approach. Now, another is the technical skills, that is a job knowledge skills. So, training can be given into a particular technical skills, that is the what type of the operational knowledge that can be provided. Third one is the social skills or the HR skills are there. Now, here you will find that is the social skills are there, where the person how to work in a peer group, how to interact with your boss, how to interact with your colleagues, and how to handle your the superiors, those who are maybe sometimes disruptive, or how to get work done from the subordinates, and therefore, the social skills that type of the training is required. So, many times it is required, that is to understand, like here in the social skills that is the one has to work on the 3 factors according to Fiedler's model. The Fiedler models talk about that is the what is your relationship, what type of the task and what type of position you are having, and there are 8 situations there that I will discuss further also in this training program on leadership. And then in that case you will find that is yes, that social skills are there. So, one who is able to adopt those particular social skills, he will be able to demonstrate that type of behavior at the workplace, and if it is acceptable and matching with the organization culture, he will grow, he will rise in his field. The fourth one is the techniques. There are the different techniques are there which are to be used while they in case of the training program are there. The techniques are the actually the techniques and tools. When that what type of the techniques and tools are there. So, that is a major part of this particular course, where actually I will conduct the training programs and demonstrate you, that is the how a particular training program on a particular topic that has to be conducted. Now, when we are talking about the purpose of training and development, right, the why people should attend the training program. The first and foremost, by common sense we understand that is a performance improvement. And what is a performance improvement? Please link it with the goal, right. So, whenever we talk about the particular goal, then it will be the how this performance improvement that will link to the goal. What is a goal? Goal may not be necessarily promotion, but definitely a recognition can be a goal. That is, whatever task you do, your peers they say, oh, this task is wonderfully done by this Mr. X. So, in that case this training program should help to improve the performance, and then if the performance is improvement is there, then it will be lead to the achievement of the goal. Second is, when you are talking about the training basically, so we are talking about the skill updating, and if the skill updating is there, then definitely the person will like to come. For example, if somebody wants to use a particular software, then he comes for a training program where how you can make the use of that particular software, and then the skill updating can be done by using that particular software, how to handle that particular software, how the commands are to be used, are in the case of the machineries, then the how that machine is to be used if any imported machine or the purchased new machine is there, and then in that case the what type of the skills are required, and skills updating will be done by that particular person. So, that will be very important in case of the skill updating. Then organizations is having the number of problems. These problems can be on the basis of the technical side, can be basis on the HR side, or basis on the business environmental, on the social side or environmental side, right. So, therefore, nowadays the lot of focus is there the industries are supposed to contribute towards the environment, and then they should not pollute the environment. So, that can be also there, or there may be the problems on the legal side. Lot of problems are there in the legal side. Then in that case, if organization is lacking in that, then that type of the training programs are to be given, maybe on the labor laws, maybe on the Factories Act, maybe on the Industrial Dispute Act, maybe on Payment of Bonus Act, maybe on the Wages and Compensation Act, maybe on ESI Provident Fund Act. So, therefore, in that case you will find that is there may be the lot of solving the all problems, organizational problems are there, and those problems are to be solved, and for that purpose these training and development programs have to be there. So, training program can be there on IR, industrial relations, because now these industrial relations is again after these Maruti and Honda cases, now it has been emerged, and therefore, for in between with our time to this time, then there was more and more focus on the HRD, and there more and more focus on the potential, and because of the IT industries and service industries were dominating more. So, therefore, in that case that solving the organizational problems that was having the different nature. So, that type of training programs can be also conducted. And then the new employee orientation, this is also very important. Now, you see that is the in some organizations orientation program goes up to the 3 months, in some organization it goes up to 3 days, and maybe in some organization up to the 3 hours only, and after from the next day you start working on this work, right. So, therefore, in that case what is important is that is these orientation program also wherever it is popular, and wherever they want to go for this particular training program, then they are supposed that is they go for this particular orientation program in a systematic way, and these employees, those who are the new employees, those who are joining, they get understanding of the organization, they get understanding of the culture. When I was in Shriram 92 to 95, that time it was a 1 week orientation program was very popular there, and then the employees were supposed to know about the Shriram group and organize the different other sister concerns and the culture of the organization, and then what is expected from them. So, that is a organizational citizenship behavior, OCB. That is what sort of the OCB, that new employee orientations are there, then that was to be conducted. Then the preparation for the promotion, that is the many times the training programs are given to handle the next level jobs, and then in that case if you are qualified for that particular position, maybe simple example of decision making process, how to take the right decisions, right. So, in the higher position that may be required, that is you will be accountability will be higher, your responsibility will be to take the very critical decisions. So, are you able to go with this particular preparation for the promotion or not, and then critical decisions are to be taken care of. So, therefore, in that case it is very important, that is what is the orientation of the training program, purpose of the training program. If it is performance improvement, it is skill updating, solving organizational problems and new employee orientations and preparation for promotion, that has to be taken into consideration. What is the purpose? Now, we will talk about the HRM approaches to training development in organization. What are the approaches in training and development organizations? Now, you see, the most of the time we are talking about the human capital approach, that is a training is an investment in HR that gives returns in the form of the increased productivity. Whenever we talk about the human capital, right. So, human capital is the comprehensive way to understand the manpower in the organization. The word has been capital has been keep in mind was mentioned by keeping in mind, that is the if manpower is there, what is the return on investment on manpower, and those who are the creative, those who are able to bring the new practices, those who are able to create a better performance environment. So, these type of the employees, they are the human capital. So, it is not that if you are doing your routine and maintenance job, you are a manpower, right, or you are human resource, but the human resource to the human capital journey. So, human resource is required to do a particular task, but when you add the value in that particular task, then you are representing the human capital, because whatever investment is there, salary is same, time is same, but the return, that is much more than what is expected from this particular manpower human resource, and therefore, in that case it is the increase the productivity is there, and therefore, increase the productivity is there, creating work environment itself, motivating the employees itself, because it is not only the quantitative terms, but it can be in the qualitative terms also. In that measurement also you will find, that is the human capital creation has been developed. Human capital creation also have the number of dimensions that we will discuss later on. The strategic framework, another important aspect is training results in the development of those skills and competencies in employees that are unique and superior to competitors. So, these strategies framework, right, these are very important. What are those skills and the competencies in employees which is required? So, these HRM approach to the training and development organization is that is the especially this updating the skills, because whatever the skills were there 2 years back, nowadays that may not be the relevant, and then if you want to make these relevant practices, right, then definitely in that case those skills and competencies that has to be redefine the competencies. If we redefine the competencies, we will find that it is becoming the measurement for the strategic framework. The strategies are to be made in the context of the latest skills and the competencies, and the future competencies and skills which are required, those are in employees that are unique and superior to competitors. So, before the competitors demonstrate that, our training and development program should overcome with that particular requirement and demonstrate the first one. So, this is leading to the competitive advantage to the organization. The strategic framework, right, that should be very clear, that is to be decided by the top management, but top management should have that particular vision, that is in the next 5 years minimum, that is the what type of the strategies that will like to work and what type of the competencies and skills which will be required. So, it is known in advance, and if it is known in advance, then the organization will be more competitive. Then contingent approach. Contingent approach is, that is a dependency relationship between the training and business strategy of the firm. So, whatever we have talked about, that is whatever the HR measurements, HR approach is there, and then whatever the strategy is there, and whatever the external environmental factors. The dependency, that relationship between training and business strategy of the firm, and the business strategy, all of us know whether it is the blue ocean strategy or not, that we talk about, that is the how this particular manpower is to be developed in that particular case of the requirement in the skills and competencies. So, we want to make a linkages between the business strategy and staffing and training practices, and therefore, in that case the type of business strategy is defender. Then characteristics, we will talk types of business strategies, characteristics, HRM requirements, and the staffing and training practices that we will talk about. The type of business strategy defender will be, that is compete on the basis of the low price and high quality and stable environment. So, this is the basic funda. That is the one should have the compete on the basis of the low price. Naturally, if you want to create the more customer database, and high quality, that is what type of the quality is required, and then definitely that product with the high quality with the low price, and then it should be for the long time, that is a stable environment, right. If it is a fluid environment, then definitely in that case that the defender will not be, type of business strategy will not work. So, what should be the characteristics? Characteristics should be limited product line, emphasize the technical efficiency, long term perspective, functional structure, and division of labor. So, these are the characteristics that has to be matched with these particular business strategies. So, what type of the HRM requirement will be there? Now, here is the role of the training and development comes. Skill specialization, that is the HRM requirement will be, that is the skill specialization is to be understood with the whatever the your strategy is, business strategy is there. Emphasis on the production and finance functions, because you cannot adopt the strategy without the financial support, and therefore, and then your capacity to build that particular requirement. So, therefore, in that case the production and finance functions that will become very important, and then build the skills. On basis of this competitive strategy, whatever characteristics are there, we have to build the skills. When we talk about the building the skills, the staffing and the training practices, that becomes very important. The skill type, in staffing and training practices, skill type will be staff and train for the narrow skills. So, therefore, it is a specific skills which will be required, because when you are going for the low price, when you are going for the high quality, then definitely that your the skill specialization that will be narrowed down. So, it will not be vague. So, if you want to develop that particular business defender strategies, then the staff should be trained for the narrow skills, very specific skills, which pinpoint skills which will demonstrate the high performance as per your requirement. What will be the skill course? Internal staffing and in-house training, and that because it is an internal matter of the organization, and therefore, specifically we are developing about that particular product at the low price, then it is required, that is we go by the internal staffing and in-house training. Now, I would like to take the another strategy, and that is the prospectus strategy. Whenever we are talking about the prospectus strategy, compete on the basis of the new markets and new products, unstable environment. Now, here if we compare, then here we will find that it was a stable environment, and here we are talking about the unstable environment, right, because of the new market and the new products are there. There was the low price and high quality product was there, so already existing, but here it is totally new situation is there. Now, what will be the characteristics? Characteristics of the organization will be diverse product lines, emphasize product innovation, rapid growth, decentralized structure and the divisionalized structure. So, therefore, in that case it will be the characteristics will be totally different as compared to the characteristics in the Defender. In Defender they were talking about that is a division of labor, functional structure. Here we are talking about the decentralized structure and the divisionalized structures, rapid growth, right. There we are going with the long term perspectives, but here is the rapid growth is there. If this is the characteristic, then we have to go for the HRM requirements. What are the HRM requirements? HRM requirements are the skill flexibility and emphasis on marketing or sales and on R&D. So, here we were going by the skill specialization, here we are going by the skill flexibility. So, therefore, the skill type will be also different. So, skill specialization to the skill flexibility, from the Defender to the Prospector, the scenario is changed, it is totally different. So, therefore, in that case this skill flexibility, and then what will be the emphasis? Here was the emphasis on production and finance, here is the emphasis on the marketing, sales and on R&D. So, you will find that it is having the totally different approach in case of this particular the HRM requirements. So, if this is the situation and the nature of business and the style of strategy, then definitely the HRM requirements they are going to be the different. And if you are already, because it is a long term, it is a long term perspective, but here therefore it is long term perspective. So, you are building the skills, but it is a rapid growth, and rapid growth means you have to buy the skills. So, in that case you will find that is the HRM requirements will be totally different. So, business strategies and designing the training programs and the type of training, they are totally depend on that is what type of the strategy the organization is going to adopt. If the organization is going for the long term, then the skill type and the training practices that will be different. But if the organization is going for the rapid growth, then in that case the skill type will be staff and train for the broad skills. It will not be the narrow skills as in compared to the staffing and training practices in the linkage business strategy and staffing. So, that will not be applicable. So, what is required is from narrow skills to the broad skills, right. So, that in that case the skill type that totally change. So, what type of the training programs will be there? External staffing will be there. External staffing, the consultants and the outsources, that will be more and more popular in this particular type of the strategies. And external training whenever is required, then employees either they will call they will be sent to the external trainings or the external trainers will be called. So, therefore, in that case it becomes very important, that is whatever the linkage you bring between the business strategy and the staffing and training practices, that becomes very important. So, it has to be taken into the consideration, that is what is your linkages and what type of the training practices you are going to adopt. If you are able to adopt this type of the connection, understanding that is the overall organizational business strategies, then the type of training which you can consider, and then that will be the skill type and skill source in the case of the Defender case, and in case of the Prospector, and that can be decided. So, therefore, we will go with the types of training. There are the different types of training are there. The skills training, it includes certain basic skills like reading, writing skills, computing skills, speaking, listening, problem solving, etc. are taught, as already I have mentioned in the first slide. That is whatever the skills are there, those skills will be more and more, that will be about this particular type of the skills, that is the knowledge skills and the technical skills, HR skills, all. So, here is the problem solving skill seems to be a very important. Then as I mentioned, that is there can be the middle management and the senior management. Sometimes they are those who are at the maintenance level. So, refresher training is required. The focus is on short term courses that would help employees learn about the latest development and developments in their respective fields. So, this type of the refresher training that would help employees to learn about the latest developments, and because they are working since long in that particular area. So, definitely that is a rich knowledge base is there, but looking to the current challenges, that has to be refreshed, and then the new practices, is there any need of the new practices, and what are the new practices, that has to be communicated, and therefore the refreshers training that will work. Then the cross functional training will be there. This helps employees perform operations in areas other than their assigned job, because nowadays there is nothing like a specialization. So, wherever is the need of the organization will look forward your support in their particular area, and if they find it is yes, you are having the potential also. In earlier model we have discussed about the potential appraisal. So, if there is a potential appraisal, then the cross functional training that will do, and then definitely that type of the training that will be provided, and one can make the excellence in the another field also. And last is the team training. And when we talk about the team training, this is concerned with the how team members should communicate with each other, working in a team, and how they should cooperate to get ahead, and how they should handle conflictual situations, as I mentioned earlier, how to find their way using collective wisdom. So, therefore, in that case, if this type of the issues are there, then definitely at the team training that will be more and more effective will be there. So, in the types of training, this can be skill oriented, refreshers training oriented, cross functional training, and the team training that can be there. These are the different types of training which can be decided on the basis of the business strategy, the requirement of the organization, and the need of the manpower which is existing, human resource existing in that particular organization. So, this is all about the types of training and the designing of the training program. Thank you.